Hey, part due, part two. I don't even know if due means two. Maybe in Italian? I don't know. Look, here's my coffee. It's from Barista on Alberta Street, Northeast Alberta Street. So, coming at you from my office at home, my home office. I'm going to talk for the part two lecture, week 3, about the way in which the short story, which has really surged in the 20th century. Hemingway was writing short stories. He has a bunch of them in his beautiful little book called In Our Time. Sherwood Anderson in Winesburg, Ohio has a couple pretty short stories. I wouldn't say they're short, they're a couple pages long. But it's really in the last 30 years that short stories have taken off. Writers like Pamela Painter, Lydia Davis, Amy Hemphill have really made a huge impact, and a lot of magazines publish short stories. It's no surprise then that as more people are writing short stories, that other older short prose forms would come into play. In other words, that we would begin to borrow from some of the older oral forms, like the myth, like fables, and fairy tales. Aesop's fables, Grimm's fairy tales, Greek and Roman mythology. So I'm going to talk about some of the qualities of those forms, and with the hope that you might see, especially in Lydia Davis's work and even in Iain Kawata's Nightmares, that you kind of see some qualities of those older oral forms at play. Most obvious, myths especially, and fables, not so much fairy tales, but myths are a concise form. They are a brief form. And so already we have a history of brevity built in. All myths, fables, and fairy tales and nightmares are full of distortions, right? They're full of unnatural occurrences. They're full of impossible shifts or leaps in time, shape-shifting from a human to an animal to an object. Fables especially, and fairy tales, make use of anthropomorphization or anthropomorphized beings. So inanimate objects all of a sudden take on human life, or animals take on human qualities. A rabbit starts talking all of a sudden. They tend to be stories that are not driven by character. Okay, in the way that realistic fiction is, in the way that the short stories we've been reading are. There's no specificity in characters. There's not like Henry or, Nick Adams, right? Or Nick Carraway. The characters tend to be more generally named. The stories tend to be driven by story itself. By action and event and even metaphor or symbol. Myths speak to creation and destruction. I think Lydia Davis's 13th Woman sort of borrows from mythology or fables more than anything. But, the myth came from the sort of need to figure out how we were created and how we will eventually be destroyed. Or destroy ourselves, I guess. In all of these stories, there's, just because of the old form, there's an echo of the oral. There's an echo of storytelling. There's an echo of vocalization, of voiciness. the thing that I see most often that is sort of delightful in like Lydia Davis's work or Ian Kawata's is just the great freedom to bring distortion into the work. And it's not like these short forms are the only forms that make use of distortion or fabulism, but you know, Kafka's a great example, the story Metamorphoses. Gregor Samsa, he's a bureaucrat and he wakes up and he's turned into a bug. That doesn't happen in real life, but in stories and literature, it can. I think one thing to think about too is that these forms, when they're borrowed by literary writing, they become a literary form. And so even though they're not character driven, I think their intention is to reveal complexity, is to reveal contradiction. And they also want to be beautifully made sentences, be beautifully made stories. So there's an emphasis on the making, on the language and the sounds of the words and the sentences that you may not have in mythology and that you may not have in fairy tales, but of course there are exceptions. I mean, Grimm's fairy tales are beautiful. All right, so finally, I was going to mention that the two writers that have really written quite a bit of sort of contemporary fairy tales, Lydia Davis, Collected Stories. Go to your bookstore or your closest bookstore and purchase a copy. I only photocopied you one for sure that kind of borrows from those forms. There's a bunch of them in there. And then the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood has a nice little short story collection called Simple Murders, and there's a bunch of little fables and fairy tales in that book too. Finally, that brings us to Nightmares, right? Nightmares, that's not an ancient story form, but it's similar in that it's really it's a form that draws from the psyche, from the subconscious, from the sort of deep animal self, and so for me, Kawata's pieces, because they're so full of distortions and impossibilities, they're really driven around those impossible things, those distortions. They feel often like fairy tales to me, like very short fairy tales gone very wrong. So it made sense to pair these two readings together. All right, I hope you guys are doing well. I've been enjoying reading your work immensely, reading your short prose. It's really terrific. I enjoy your generosity in our discussions and on Twitter. Have a good week 3.